You are standing in a Pilot gas station parking lot in Cedar Falls, Nebraska, at 11 minutes past 6 in the morning, and you are watching 47 grown men go quiet at the sight of a 14-year-old Buick with a cracked windshield and Missouri plates gone soft with rust. There is a woman asleep in the driver's seat, a blanket the color of dishwater pulled to her chin, and on the passenger seat beside her, folded the way a person folds something they cannot bring themselves to throw away, is a leather cut with a patch that half the men in that lot have not seen in 9 years. One of them will recognize it before he understands why his hands have started shaking. That recognition will cost the chapter $11,000, a grave visit, and something none of them have a name for yet. Stay until the end. You will want to know what happens at that grave. 2 years before that morning, the woman had still believed she would find a job. The bridge is a short one. 11 months of it fits in the time it takes to drive from Joplin to the Kansas line, and after that the specifics stop mattering the way months do when a person is only trying to survive them. What matters is where she started, and where she started was a rented duplex in Carthage, Missouri, with a landlord who did not care that her husband had been dead for 7 years, and that the check she'd been living on had finally, quietly, stopped coming. She had sold the television first, then the recliner he used to sit in with his boots off, heels cracked from decades of standing on concrete. Then, in a gas station outside Springfield with the AC blowing lukewarm over her collarbone, she had sold her wedding ring to a man who waited on a little digital scale and didn't meet her eyes. She kept the jacket. It hung, these days, from a hook she'd screwed into the car's headliner herself, using a hex key and a curse word so that it would not slide onto the floor when she braked. She did not wear it. She was careful about that, careful in the particular way of someone guarding something they are afraid of using up. At night, in whatever lot or church parking lot or Walmart edge she had settled into, she would sometimes reach back and touch the leather where his name had been stitched, and the small tremor that Patch gave was, some weeks, the only human contact she had. She had learned the discipline of invisibility. Which pumps had cameras? Which diner would let a woman sit 2 hours over one coffee if she tipped in cash and left before the lunch rush? Which library branches had bathrooms with locks? It was a life built entirely out of not being noticed, and she had gotten good at it, the way people get good at things they never wanted to learn. Which was why, on that particular morning in Cedar Falls, when the first engine cut off 6 feet from her window, she did not wake gently. She woke like an animal that has just heard the wrong kind of silence. The second engine cut off, and then a third, and the gravel lot outside the laundromat where she had parked for the night, filled with a stillness that was somehow louder than the noise had been. She kept her eyes at slit width, the old habit, watching through lashes so that anyone glancing in would see only a woman asleep, not a woman calculating distances to the door handle, to the ignition, to the tire iron she kept wedged under the passenger seat and had never once used. Boots on gravel, not hurried. That was the thing she would remember later. How unhurried it all was. How the men did not swarm the car the way trouble usually swarmed. Fast and loud and already shouting. These moved like men who had nowhere else to be, which frightened her more, because she had learned that urgency was often a kind of mercy. Urgency meant someone wanted something from you and was in a hurry to get it. This was patience, and patience was for people who intended to stay. She counted 3 shapes in the side mirror, then a 4th, cutting long morning shadows across the asphalt, the sun still low enough that it turned the chrome on their machines into something almost holy, something that hurt to look at directly, denim and leather, gray in the beards. One of them had a limp he did not try to hide, dragging his left boot slightly with each step, and she filed that away too, the way she filed everything. A limp meant an old injury. An old injury meant history. History meant the man had once been young enough to get hurt badly and had lived long enough afterward to stop minding. Her hand found the door lock without her telling it to. It was already locked. It had been locked every night for 2 years. The nearest one, the one with the limp, stopped an arm's length from her window and did not lean down, did not knock, did not do any of the things a stranger does when he wants something from a woman, alone in a car at 6 in the morning. He simply looked, not at her face first, at the back seat, where the jacket lay folded, the way it had lain folded every night since she'd learned better than to wear it in daylight, since daylight was when people asked questions she had no answers for anymore. She watched his eyes find the patch, watched something move through his face the way weather moves through a valley, arriving from somewhere she couldn't see and changing everything it touched. He said something to the man beside him, low, without turning his head, and the second man's hand came up off his belt and hovered there, not reaching for anything, just hovering, the way a hand hovers over a wound it isn't sure it's allowed to touch. The man with the limp took a step back from the window, and the retreat was somehow louder than an approach would have been. He raised a hand, not to her, but to the others, a flat gesture that meant wait, meant stand down, meant something in a language she recognized because her husband used to speak it too, years ago, in a kitchen that no longer existed. Behind him the lot had gone still, 12, maybe 15 bikes cooling in the gray light, ticking as their engines gave up the last of their heat, and not one man moved toward her car. They stood the way men stand at a funeral when they don't know the family well enough to approach the casket, but too well to leave. She did not roll down the window. Her hand stayed on the lock, pressing it flatter against the door, as if pressure were a kind of proof. The man with the limp crouched then, finally, bringing his face level with hers through the glass, and up close she could see what the years had done to him. A scar tracking white through one eyebrow, a nose that had been broken at least twice, eyes the pale, washed-out blue of denim, gone through too many summers. He did not smile. Smiling would have been a lie, and she understood, in the animal part of her brain that had kept her alive in parking lots for 2 years, that he knew it too. "Ma'am," his voice came through the glass, thinned but clear. "Whose jacket is that?" The question did not come dressed as an accusation. It came the way a man asks after something precious he thought was lost. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the second man's hovering hand finally dropped to his side, long enough that somewhere behind them a car door opened and a third rider got out slow, unhurried, the way you approach a spooked horse. "It was my husband's," she said, and the words came out rough, unused, like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been touched in a long time. The man with the limp did not move. But something in his shoulders changed, some tension releasing and another tightening in its place, and he said a name, just a name, quiet, half a question, the way a person says a word they haven't spoken aloud in 9 years, testing whether it still fits in the mouth. She felt her whole body go cold in the August heat. She had not heard that name spoken by another living person since the funeral. She did not answer right away. The name hung in the heat between them, small and enormous at once, and she watched the man's mouth as if she could read in it some proof that she had imagined the whole thing, that the parking lot, the badge, the sun flattening everything to white, had conjured a ghost out of exhaustion. But he did not take the name back. He let it sit there, the way you let a coin settle on a table, to see if it will keep spinning. "That's him," she said finally. That was his name. The second rider, the one whose hand had dropped, looked away first, toward the highway, as if the traffic noise gave him somewhere to put his face. The third one, the slow-moving one, had stopped a few yards off, close enough to hear, far enough not to crowd her. None of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed on the ears. The man with the limp put one hand against the roof of her car, not touching her, just steadying himself, the way a man does when the ground has tilted a half-degree beneath him and he wants no one to see it happen. 9 years, he said. She did not ask how he knew the number. Some part of her understood, in the way you understand weather before it arrives, that this was not a stranger fumbling toward a memory. This was a man who had done the arithmetic before, more than once, alone, in rooms she would never see. "You knew him," she said. It was not quite a question. "Rode with him." His voice had gone even quieter. "Long time ago." The word rode landed differently than would have. It carried distance and intimacy both, hours on a highway, a shoulder-to-shoulder silence that passed for conversation among men who did not trust words the way they trusted miles. She felt something in her chest loosen and tighten in the same motion, the way it did whenever a stranger's face reminded her of a life she had spent 2 years trying to stop reaching for. Behind him, A fourth rider had drifted close without her noticing, phone in hand, thumb hovering, not filming, just waiting, the way men wait when they sense something is about to require witnesses. The officer, forgotten for a moment, cleared his throat once and said nothing further, watching the four of them the way a man watches weather change over a field, uncertain whether to take shelter or stay and see what falls. She became aware, distantly, that her hand was still resting against the sun-warmed vinyl of the seat, fingers curled into the cracked leather like it was the only fixed thing left in the world. The man with the limp straightened slowly, wincing at whatever old injury lived in that leg, and looked past her, not at her face, but at the jacket, at the patch stitched crooked at the shoulder, the way it always had been, the way only someone who'd sewn it on with his own hands would remember it being stitched. "You mind," he said, "if I make a call?" She did not answer right away. The question had the shape of politeness, but the weight of something else, something that made the officer shift his boots in the gravel, and the fourth rider lower his phone an inch, as if even he understood this was no longer a moment for evidence. She looked at the man with the limp, at the gray in his beard that had gone the color of ash left too long in a cold stove, and she thought of all the ways she had learned, over 2 years, to say no to people who wanted to help her. No, she didn't need a ride. No, she didn't need a number for a shelter. No, she was fine. She was managing. She would be moving on by morning. The no had become a kind of muscle, exercised so often it no longer required thought. But this was not an offer of help. This was a man asking permission to call someone about a jacket. "It's not for sale," she said, and heard how foolish it sounded, even as she said it, how it revealed more than she meant to reveal, that she had been asked before, that someone, some pawn shop owner or desperate stranger, had once offered her $40 for the leather without knowing what it was worth, and she had walked out into the heat rather than answer. "Wasn't going to ask," the man said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that made the officer take a half step back, unconsciously, the way people step back from a held breath. "Just need to know where you got it." "He gave it to me," she said, "a long time ago." The man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected and had been hoping, against reason, would turn out to be wrong. He did not ask the name. He did not need to. His eyes had already gone to the patch again, to the crooked stitching along the seam, and something crossed his face that she recognized because she had worn it herself, in mirrors, in gas station windows, in the black glass of the car at night, the look of a person doing arithmetic with grief, adding up years, checking the sum against a memory that refused to be wrong. The fourth rider had gone still, entirely now, phone forgotten at his side. Somewhere down the row of pumps, a bell rang as another car pulled in, indifferent to all of it, and the sound seemed to come from very far away. "Ma'am," the man with the limp said, "I think I need you to sit down." She did not sit down. She had spent 2 years learning that a body which sits can be made to stay, and staying was a luxury she had trained herself out of the way other people trained themselves out of sugar, out of cigarettes, out of hope in general. So she stood there with one hand on the warm metal of the pump and let the dizziness pass through her instead of taking her down with it. "I'm fine," she said, which was a lie so old it no longer felt like one. The man with the limp did not argue. He had the look of someone who had learned, a long time ago, and at some cost, which battles were worth fighting and which were better left to move around. Instead, he turned his head, slightly, toward the fourth rider, the young one, the one whose hands did not yet know how to be still, and something passed between them without words, an entire conversation conducted in the language of men who have stood next to each other in bad places. "Go get him," the older man said. The younger one did not ask who. He was already moving, already swinging one leg over his bike, and the engine caught on the first try, with a sound like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. He was gone down the frontage road before she had time to ask what was happening, dust rising behind him in a thin gold ribbon that hung in the air long after the sound of him had faded. The man with the limp turned back to her. Up close she could see the tremor in his jaw that came from clenching it too hard for too many years, the particular gray of his beard that was not the gray of age alone, but the gray that comes early to men who have buried more people than they have walked at weddings. "That patch," he said again, and this time his voice had gone quieter, almost careful, the way a person speaks near something that might still be alive. "You said he gave it to you." "Yes." "When?" She looked past him, toward the highway, toward the heat shimmer rising off the asphalt in long silver ribbons that made the horizon look like it was dissolving. 9 years ago, she said, in October. The word landed on him visibly, a small collapse somewhere behind the eyes, and for a moment he looked less like a man standing at a gas pump and more like a man standing at the edge of something he had walked around for a very long time without ever quite falling in. October, he repeated, not to her, but to himself, testing the month the way a person tests ice. Behind him, 2 more engines were approaching from the direction the young rider had gone, not 1 bike returning, but 2, then 3, the sound multiplying itself against the flat country silence until it was no longer a sound, but a pressure, something felt in the chest before it was heard. The man with the limp did not look at them yet. He kept his eyes on her. "Ma'am," he said, "I think you'd better tell me his name." She said the name the way she said everything now, quietly, as if the words might be taken from her before she finished spending them, and the man with the limp did not move for a long moment after she'd finished, the way a building does not move for a long moment after the load-bearing wall has already failed somewhere inside it. He asked her to say it again. She did. He turned his head toward the 2 bikes now idling behind him, engines settling into that low percussive murmur that isn't quite silence, and something passed across his face that she could not read, because it was not grief exactly, and it was not shock exactly. It was closer to the look of a man doing arithmetic he had sworn he would never have to do again. The riders behind him cut their engines one after another, and the quiet that followed was thicker than the noise had been. One of them, heavier through the shoulders, gray in the beard, swung off his bike without taking his eyes from her, the way a man approaches something he has been warned about his whole life, and finally sees for himself. He didn't speak. He looked at the jacket she was still holding folded against her chest, like something that might be pried from her, and then he looked at the man with the limp, and some understanding moved between them without a single word carrying it, the kind of understanding that only exists between men who have buried the same people. 9 years, the man with the limp said, mostly to the gray-bearded one, mostly not to her at all. October. The gray-bearded one didn't answer right away. He was still looking at her, at the sun damage on her hands, at the way her boots had been resoled with something that wasn't quite the right color, at the car behind her, with its back seat folded down and its windows fogged from the inside with the particular grime of a life lived in 300 square feet of steel. He was reading her the way the man with the limp had read her at the pump, except slower, except with something starting to crack open behind his eyes that had not cracked open in a long time. "You knew him," she said. It wasn't a question. She had learned, in 2 years of asking for nothing, to recognize the shape of a man remembering someone he'd loved. The gray-bearded one nodded once, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with the road dust or the heat. "We buried him," he said. "We've been paying respects to a grave for 9 years. He looked at the jacket again. "We didn't know there was a debt still walking around unpaid." The words sat between them for a long moment, and the parking lot noise came back in slowly. A truck downshifting on the frontage road, the buzz of the diner's sign flickering through its dead letters. Somewhere a dog barking at nothing. She did not ask what debt. She had spent 2 years not asking questions that might come with answers she couldn't afford, and the habit did not leave her now, just because the answer was standing in front of her wearing a chest full of memorial patches. The gray-bearded one turned his head toward the 2 men who had drifted closer during the exchange, both of them younger, both of them watching the jacket like it might move on its own. "Get the president," he said, not loud. He didn't need to say it loud. One of the younger men peeled off toward the row of motorcycles at the edge of the lot, walking fast without running, the particular gait of a man who understood the difference between urgency and panic, and knew which one this called for. She watched him go, then looked back at the gray-bearded one, and something in her face had shifted. Not hope. She had learned not to let her face do hope anymore. but attention. The same attention she'd been giving the world for 2 years, reading it for threat and opportunity in equal measure, because a woman living in a Buick did not have the luxury of being surprised by anything twice. He never talked about a wreck, she said. Not the kind you're talking about. He said he laid the bike down once, out past Barstow, tore up his shoulder. That's the only story I ever got. That's not the story, the gray-bearded one said, and something moved across his face like weather crossing a field, there and then folded away again. That's the story he gave you so you wouldn't lie awake nights. She absorbed that, the way she absorbed most things now, without visible reaction, filing it into whatever place inside her still had room for new grief about a man 9 years dead. Behind them, the sound of engines starting up rippled through the lot, first one, and then answered by two more, the particular cough and catch of old machines being woken from a stillness they hadn't expected to break this afternoon. The gray-bearded one didn't look at the bikes. He kept looking at her, at the jacket folded over her arm now instead of on her back, at the way she'd gone very still, the way people go still when they are bracing for something, without knowing yet whether to brace against hope or against harm. "Sit down," he said, nodding at the diner's cracked concrete step. "This is going to take longer than standing up." She sat because her legs had already decided for her, the way a body sometimes knows before the mind agrees, and the concrete step held the day's heat, like a stove left on low, seeping up through her jeans, through the thin soles of shoes she'd resoled twice, with glue bought at a dollar store outside Needles. The gray-bearded one lowered himself down beside her, with the careful economy of a man whose knees had opinions about weather and years both, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the lot filled in around the silence, more engines catching, the scrape of a kickstand, someone's low voice asking a question that got answered with a single word she couldn't make out. 9 years ago, he said finally, on the 40, coming back from a run down near Kingman. He was looking at the horizon when he said it, not at her, the way men look at distances when they are trying to keep something in their chest from climbing up into their throat. Truck came across the median, no warning, no brakes we ever found skid marks for. His hands, folded loose between his knees, tightened once, and then let go again. Two of ours were riding point. He was riding sweep. He saw it before either of them did. She did not ask what happened next. She had already lived the shape of it for 9 years without the details, had built her own version out of insurance paperwork and a folded flag, and the particular hollow way people had said, "There was nothing anyone could have done." A sentence she'd learned to hate the way you hate a scar that never stops itching. He'd put himself between, the man said. That's the whole story. That's all of it. Two men who are still walking around today, still got kids, still got grandkids now, because he made a choice in about a second and a half that most men couldn't make in a lifetime of thinking about it. A hawk, crossed low over the lot, its shadow sliding across the cracked pavement, over her boots, over the jacket folded in her lap like something asleep. She watched the shadow go and did not watch his face, because she understood, in the specific and exhausted way of someone who has spent 2 years learning to read weather in other people's silences, that he was giving her something he had never said out loud before, not even to the men whose lives it had bought. "We didn't know your name," he said. "We knew his. We've been saying his name at the memorial run every October for 9 years, and we didn't know yours. And I think that's a debt. And I think debts don't go away just because nobody remembers who's owed." Somewhere behind them, an older voice, rougher, slower, called out a question that carried her husband's road name inside it like a stone dropped into still water. The name landed in the lot like a struck match, and she turned toward it the way a person turns toward weather they have been waiting on for a long time without admitting it. The man who had spoken was older than the others, 70 maybe, with a beard gone the color of ash and a limp he did not try to hide, working his way across the gravel with the deliberate care of a body that had been rebuilt more than once. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at the jacket in her lap, not at her face, the way men of a certain generation look at things they are afraid might disappear if they are looked at too directly. "That his old lady?" the older man asked, though he was not asking the man beside her. He was asking the lot, the hawk, the cracked pavement, the whole indifferent afternoon. "Yes," she said, before anyone could answer for her. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than it had come out in 2 years of gas station bathrooms and county clerks, and men, behind counters who looked at her like a problem to be managed. "I'm his old lady." The old man's jaw worked once, twice, the way a man's jaw works when it is trying to decide whether to let something out or hold it down a while longer. He had known her husband, she understood, not from the memorial runs but from before, from some particular Tuesday or Thursday of a life she had only ever gotten in fragments, second-hand, translated through grief. He had ridden beside him. Maybe he had been one of the 2 men still walking around with grandchildren because of a second and a half that could not be taken back or repaid, only carried. 9 years, he said, and not one of us thought to ask what happened to the wife. Nobody answered that. It was not a question that wanted answering, only stating, the way men state facts they have been avoiding because the facts indict them. She looked down at the jacket again, at the patch worn thin at the shoulder seam, where his arm had rubbed against it for however many thousand miles, and she thought, not for the first time, but for the first time in company, that grief was supposed to have a shape, an ending, a place you arrived at and stopped. Hers had only ever had a car, a back seat, a rotation of parking lots memorized by their proximity to a bathroom and a streetlight that didn't attract trouble. The younger man beside her, the one who had done the talking, who had a scar through one eyebrow like a punctuation mark, was watching the old man now, some silent exchange passing between them that she could not read but understood the weight of, the way you understand the weight of a held breath in a room, even from outside it. "Somebody needs to call the president," the old man said finally. "Tonight, not tomorrow." The younger man with the scarred eyebrow did not argue. He simply took out his phone and stepped a few feet away, toward the edge of the gravel lot where the light from the diner sign did not reach, and she watched his silhouette bend slightly at the shoulders as he spoke, the way men do when the conversation matters more than they want it to. The old man stayed beside her. He had not touched the jacket again since she'd shown it to him, as though it were something that required permission each time, and she noticed that, the restraint of it, the way his hands stayed loose at his sides instead of reaching. "You don't have to wait around for this," she said. "Whatever this is." "We do, though," he said it plainly, without wait, the way a man states the hours he works or the miles on his truck. That's kind of the whole point. She did not understand what he meant by that, not fully, but something in the register of his voice made her not ask. The night had cooled the way August nights sometimes did after 10, the heat lifting off the blacktop in a thin, visible shimmer that caught the neon and scattered it. Somewhere behind the diner, a screen door opened and shut, and a moth batted itself twice against the window glass before giving up. She thought about her car, parked 2 lots over behind a shuttered auto parts store, the back seat where she had slept for longer than she wanted to count anymore, and she felt, absurdly, a flush of something like embarrassment, that these men were seeing this, seeing her, in the exact moment she had spent 2 years arranging her life to avoid. The younger man came back. His face had changed slightly, some of the boy gone out of it. "He's coming," he said. "Says don't let her leave." "I wasn't going anywhere," she said, and it came out sharper than she meant, sharper than she'd spoken to anyone in longer than she could place. Nobody flinched. The old man nodded once, slow, as if her sharpness confirmed something for him, rather than offending it. "Good," he said. "Sit. There's coffee inside if you want it. Nobody's going to ask you for money you don't have." She almost laughed at that, a short, broken sound with no real humor in it, because it had been so long since anyone offered her anything without first calculating what it would cost her to accept. She sat anyway, back straight, jacket folded once more across her knees like a thing returned to its rightful stillness. Through the window she could see the diner clock, its red digits ticking past 11, and she understood without being told that whatever was coming would arrive changed by the hour it kept. Men riding at night for a woman they had known for 11 minutes, because of a name stitched into leather 9 years cold. The coffee, when it came, was bitter and too hot, poured by a woman with tired eyes who did not ask her name and did not need to. The old man had already said something low behind the counter, and word in a place like this moved the way water moves through cracked ground, quiet and total. She wrapped both hands around the mug because her hands wanted something to do besides shake, and she watched the parking lot through the window's grime, watched the highway beyond it lying flat and empty under sodium light, waiting the way she had learned to wait, which was without hope attached to it. The jacket stayed on her knees. She had not let it go since the old man handed it back to her, and she found herself running her thumb along the seam at the collar, the place where the leather had cracked and been restitched once, long ago, by hands she remembered without wanting to. 9 years was a long time to keep a wound quiet. It was long enough that she had almost convinced herself the wound had closed, that the 2 years in the car had scraped it down to something manageable, a callus instead of a scar. But the boy's voice, saying, "He's coming," had reopened it in the space of 4 words, and she sat now feeling it bleed in the old, familiar way, silently, where no one could see. She counted headlights instead of thinking. 3 sets passed on the highway without slowing. She noted the diner clock at 11:06, then 11:11, the digits changing with a small mechanical click that seemed too loud in the emptied room. The waitress refilled her coffee without being asked, and did not meet her eyes when she did it, which she understood as its own kind of mercy. Some people gave you privacy because they had none themselves to spare, and some gave it because they knew what it cost to be looked at when you were barely holding. The old man sat 2 stools down, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to leave her to the room alone. He had not spoken again since telling her to sit, but she felt his attention on her the way she used to feel weather change before a storm broke, some old animal instinct that had kept her alive for 2 years, sleeping in a Buick, with the doors locked and the windows cracked for air. She recognized in him the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long life learning to wait for other men, and it frightened her less than she expected, though she could not yet say why. Outside, faint at first and then unmistakable, came a sound she had not heard in 9 years, and had told herself she never wanted to hear again, the low building rumble of motorcycles, more than one, more than a few, moving toward the diner through the dark, like something the night itself had been rehearsing. The sound did not stop the way a passing car stops, fading into the distance the way things were supposed to fade. It grew instead, layer upon layer, until the windows of the diner began to hum faintly in their frames, a vibration she felt through the soles of her feet before she heard it in her ears. The coffee in her cup rippled in small concentric rings. She had felt that same tremble once before, 9 years ago, standing in a hospital hallway with fluorescent light buzzing overhead, waiting for a man in scrubs to tell her something she already knew from the way he would not look at her directly. She set the cup down. The old man beside her did not turn toward the sound. He watched her instead, the way a man watches a fence line for movement he has already guessed is coming. His hands, folded on the counter, were the hands of someone who had spent decades gripping handlebars in weather that punished exposed skin, knuckles swollen at the joints, a white seam of old scar tissue crossing the back of his left thumb, the kind of hand that had learned to read a road by vibration alone. "You don't have to be afraid of that sound," he said, quiet, not looking away from her. "I'm not afraid of the sound," she said. "I'm afraid of what it means." He considered this the way a man considers weather he cannot change, only prepare for. Outside, the headlights arrived first, sweeping in a long column across the gravel lot, throwing the shadows of the gas pumps into brief, stretched shapes against the diner wall. Then came the machines themselves, one after another, chrome catching the sodium light in flashes, engines dropping in pitch as they slowed, then idling low and patient, like something large breathing in its sleep. She counted without meaning to. An old habit, counting things that might hurt her, though she could not have said when that habit started, only that it had kept her alive in parking lots and rest stops for longer than she wanted to remember. 12, then 20, then more than she could hold in her head at once. The waitress at the counter stopped moving entirely, a coffee pot suspended in her hand. The woman in the corner booth did not turn around, but her shoulders drew inward, the particular contraction of someone deciding whether a room was still safe. The old man reached into his jacket, unhurried, and set something on the counter between them, worn, folded once, the leather gone soft and dark with age at the fold line. He did not push it toward her. He only let it sit there, close enough that she could see, in the diner's flickering light, a shape stitched into the leather that her hands remembered before her mind had finished catching up. Her hand moved before she gave it permission to. Fingers that had learned, over 2 winters, to be careful with everything. Door handles that stuck, coins counted twice, the particular economy of touching only what she owned, now hovered above a piece of leather that was not hers, had never been hers, and yet her body responded to it the way a tongue finds a missing tooth. The stitching was uneven in places, hand repaired at some point by someone who had cared more about function than symmetry. She had watched him mend it once, at a kitchen table, humming something tuneless, needle held between his teeth while he worked. She had not thought of that in years. She had made herself not think of it. The old man's eyes did not leave her face. He had the patience of a man who had waited for worse news in worse rooms, and he gave her the silence to arrive at whatever she was arriving at without hurrying her toward it. "Where?" she said, and stopped. Her voice had gone somewhere thin and far away. "Where did you get this?" "It's been in a box," he said. 9 years. Outside, the engines had cut, one by one, the parking lot settling into a hush that pressed against the diner windows like weather. Through the glass she could see them dismounting, unhurried, the way men move when they've already decided a thing is going to take as long as it takes. Leather and denim and gray beards catching the sign's red glow. None of them came toward the door yet. They stood near their machines the way men stand at a graveside, present but not intruding. She looked down at the jacket again. The patch on the left breast, the one she had sewn back on herself, twice, because the road had a way of tearing at what mattered most. She had folded that jacket into a garbage bag the week after the funeral, unable to look at it, unable to throw it away, and somewhere between the eviction and the first cold night in the car, it had simply stopped being with her. She had told herself she'd lost it. She had told herself a great many things. 9 years, she repeated, and the number sat wrong in her mouth, too small for the distance it was meant to measure. The waitress had set the coffee pot down without seeming to notice she'd done it. The woman in the booth had turned now, slowly, and was watching with the stillness of someone who recognized, without knowing the particulars, that she was witnessing something that mattered. The old man's hand rested near the jacket, not touching it, waiting. "I need you to tell me," she said, "how you have this." And outside, one of the men shifted his weight, and the gravel gave a small, dry sound beneath his boot. The old man did not answer right away. He had the kind of face that took its time with things, weathered the way fence posts get weathered, standing through weather they never asked for. His fingers, when they finally moved, did not go to the jacket but to his own collar, pulling it open at the throat to show a scar there, thin and old, silvered by years. "Found it in a duffel," he said. "Storage unit auction, outside Barstow. Man who owned it never paid his bills, never came back for it. Been 11 years since I bought that lot for $40 and a Saturday afternoon." He paused, and the pause had weight to it, like a held breath let out slow. "I didn't know whose it was, didn't know to ask. I just knew a man's cut don't belong folded up in a stranger's storage unit collecting mouse dirt." She said nothing. Her hands were flat on the table, on either side of her coffee, and she was looking at them as if they belonged to someone else. "I carried it around 10 years, he said. "Never wore it. Didn't feel right. Kept meaning to find who it belonged to, and then time does what time does, and you wake up and it's 10 years, not 10 weeks. He looked at her then, not unkindly, but with the directness of a man who had run out of patience for softening things. "You want to tell me why a dead man's colors ended up in a Barstow storage unit?" Outside, the gravel sound had stopped. The man who had shifted his weight was standing very still now, close enough to the window that his shadow fell long across the table, though he made no move to come inside. He was watching through the glass the way a man watches a fire he isn't sure yet whether to put out or feed. "He wasn't in Barstow," she said finally. "He never went to Barstow in his life. Somebody else's then. Somebody who had it after." "No." Her voice had gone very quiet. Quiet the way rooms go quiet before something is said that cannot be unsaid. "I put it there, in a unit, under my maiden name, because I didn't want." She stopped, started again. "I couldn't pay the storage after the 3rd month. I told myself I'd go back. I told myself a lot of things that year." The old man's face did not change, but something behind it did, some understanding arriving late and unwelcome. You put your own husband's cut in a unit you knew you couldn't keep paying for. I put a lot of things I couldn't keep in places I couldn't keep them, she said, and for the first time her eyes came up off her hands and met his directly. That's what losing everything looks like, from the inside. You'd be surprised what a person can let go of, if they tell themselves it's temporary long enough. The waitress, still standing there with the coffee pot forgotten in her hand, glanced toward the window, toward the shadow of the man who had not moved, and something in her face suggested she understood, before anyone said it aloud, that this diner had become a place where a debt 9 years old was finally, carefully, being counted. The old man set his cup down without drinking from it. The sound of ceramic against the table was small and final, like a gavel scaled down to fit a life. Outside, the shadow shifted, resolved itself into the shape of a second man crossing the lot, unhurried, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who had spent decades learning that nothing worth arriving at was worth running toward. Storage unit, the old man said, mostly to himself, under a maiden name. Miller's Self-Storage, out on Route 9. She said it like a confession offered to a priest who had already stopped listening for absolution and started listening for facts. Unit 114. I remember the number because it was my mother's birthday, May the 11th. I thought that meant something, picking that one. I don't anymore. The second man reached the door, paused with his hand on the frame, and looked through the glass at the booth, at the woman's hands, at the old man's face, before he came in. He did not sit. He stood at the end of the table, the way a man stands at the foot of a grave he has visited too many times to feel strange there anymore. Miller's still open? He asked. Far as I know, the old man said. 9 years of storage fees, the second man said, doing the arithmetic out loud, the way men do when they need the numbers to be real, before they let themselves feel anything about them. That's not a debt, that's a lien. That's an auction notice waiting to happen, if it hasn't happened already. The woman's shoulders drew in, a small collapsing motion, like something built out of cardboard meeting rain. I know. I looked it up 2 years ago on a library computer. There was a letter, final notice. I never opened it because I already knew what it said. Nobody spoke for a moment. The waitress had retreated to the counter, the coffee pot returned to its burner, but she kept glancing over, the way people glance at weather they can feel changing before the sky shows any sign of it. You didn't come here for coffee, the woman said finally, looking between them, understanding arriving in her, the way it had arrived in the old man minutes before, late and unwelcome, and impossible to send back. You came here because somebody called somebody. Somebody always calls somebody, the second man said. It was not unkind. It was simply how the world she had stepped out of 9 years ago still worked, gears turning in the dark whether or not you stayed to watch them. The old man reached into his jacket, produced a phone that looked absurdly modern in his weathered hand, and set it on the table without dialing yet. I need to make a call, he said, to her, not to the man beside him. Before I do, is there anything else in that unit? Anything I should know before other men start asking? She looked at the phone like it was a door she had spent 9 years bracing against, and had just watched swing open on its own. She did not answer right away. The waitress had come and gone twice with the same untouched pot, and the diner's window had gone the color of a bruise, that hour before true dark when the desert gives up its light reluctantly, in long orange strips that lay across the parking lot, like something poured out and left to dry. There's a box, she said finally, under the false floor. I didn't put it there. He did. Before. She stopped. Started again, the way a person restarts an engine that has stalled in traffic, aware of the cars behind her. Before the accident, I never opened it. I told myself it was his business, whatever was in there, and it wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I, so there was no hurry. 9 years, the old man said, not a question. A weight set down gently on the table between them. 9 years, she agreed. The second man had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic he did not want to finish. He was thinking, she could see it in the set of his jaw, about what kind of man builds a hidden compartment into a storage unit before he dies, and what kind of woman leaves it sealed for nearly a decade rather than look inside and learn something that might change the shape of her grief. You could have sold whatever was in it, the old man said. Pawned it. 2 years living out of a car, and you never once. It wasn't mine to spend, she said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Something with an edge on it, worn smooth from years of turning the same thought over. It was his. I kept it the way you'd keep a letter you weren't ready to read. You don't burn it for firewood just because you're cold. The old man nodded slowly, and did not argue further, because there was nothing in that logic a reasonable man could take issue with, only something in it that made the coffee taste like less than it had a minute ago. He picked up the phone. This isn't me deciding anything, he said to her, though it seemed also meant for the man beside him, and maybe for himself. This is me telling people what I found, so nobody decides anything without knowing what there is to decide. She watched his thumb move over the screen, watched the small green light blink awake, and felt the particular vertigo of a life that has been narrow and quiet for a long time, suddenly widening at both ends, faster than she had any say in. "Who are you calling?" she asked, though some old, tired part of her had already guessed and was already afraid of being right. "Everyone," he said. He did not say it to frighten her, and it did not, quite, though the words settled over the trailer like a change in barometric pressure, the kind that makes old injuries ache before the storm is visible on any horizon. He dialed a number he did not have to look up, one he had not called in longer than he could easily account for, reserved for things that were either emergencies or their opposite, matters too large for ordinary conversation. It rang twice. A voice answered, gravel rough, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned decades ago that nothing on the other end of a phone was worth losing his stillness over. "I found her," the old man said. No greeting. None was needed. There was a silence on the line long enough that she could hear, faintly, through the receiver, the sound of wind somewhere else, a door, a dog. Then the voice said something she couldn't make out, low, and the old man's eyes moved to her face, and stayed there, reading something in it the way he'd read the patch, the way he'd read the way she stood, when she thought no one was measuring her. "No," he said, "not asking that. Telling you I found her, and telling you where, and after that, it's not mine to carry alone." He gave the address of the lot with the flat, procedural calm of a man reporting weather, and she understood, listening to him say it, her lot, her car, the exact intersection where she had spent 2 winters believing herself invisible. That invisibility had been, all along, a kindness she'd been allowing herself, and that it was ending now, in a room that smelled of scorched coffee, without her consent and without her being able to say for certain whether consent was owed her. "How many?" she asked, when he lowered the phone, because the number mattered to her in a way she could not have explained to anyone who hadn't spent 2 years counting the ways a person could be reduced. How many blankets? How many gallons? How many days before the registration lapsed? "However many show up," he said, which was not an answer, and was also the only honest one available to him. Outside, the light was changing, the flat gold of late afternoon, sliding toward the longer, more forgiving gray of evening, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a first engine, distant, uncertain if it was even real, turned over. She sat very still while the sound gathered itself into something recognizable, the way a person sits still when they are not sure if a thing approaching is weather or is only the memory of weather. One engine became 2. 2 became a texture, low and continuous, felt in the floor before it was heard through the window. The president had not moved from where he stood by the counter, his phone dark now in his hand, and he watched her the way a man watches a fuse he has lit and cannot unlight. Not with regret, she thought, but with the particular attention of someone counting seconds he has no right to hurry. "You don't have to come out," he said. "You can sit right there as long as you need." She thought of the lot. She thought of the specific angle the morning sun took across the windshield each day, at roughly 7:15, warming the dash until the vinyl gave off a smell she had come to associate with survival, rather than poverty, the smell of a thing that has kept its shape despite everything. She thought of the folded blanket she still could not throw away, though she no longer needed it, the way some objects outlive their purpose and become instead a record, proof a person had endured a specific stretch of specific nights and could name them if asked. February the 9th, the night it dropped to 11 degrees, the night she had prayed not for rescue, but only for mourning. The engines multiplied outside in a way that stopped being countable, became instead a single low chord rolling up the frontage road, and she found she was standing, though she could not afterward say she had decided to stand, only that her body had done it, while the rest of her was still deciding whether decision was even the right word for what was happening to her. "They're not coming for the car," the president said, quietly, as if he'd read the shape of her fear before she'd finished forming it. "The car's the least of it. They're coming because a name showed up that they'd stopped expecting to hear again." She did not ask which name. She already knew, had known since the moment his voice cracked over the sound of 41 letters, and knowing it did nothing to prepare her for hearing engines arrive in a number large enough to mean that whatever was owed had been owed for a very long time, gathering interest in silence, waiting only for someone to finally read the patch correctly. They came in through the frontage road with their headlights off, the way men do when they have decided that this particular arrival is not for showing off, and the effect was stranger than any parade. A river of dark shapes moving under a sky gone the color of a healed bruise, engines idling low enough that she could hear gravel shift under boots before she could make out a single face. She counted without meaning to. It was a habit from the years in the car, counting things, miles, dollars, days since the last hot meal, and she reached 30 before she stopped, because the number had stopped being useful and started being something closer to a weight. The president did not move toward her yet. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, watching the lot fill the way a man watches weather arrive, something he has stopped trying to control a long time ago. "You don't have to say anything tonight," he said. "Nobody's asking you to explain 9 years." She realized, distantly, that her hands had found the edge of the jacket again, pressing it flat against her sternum, as though it might otherwise be taken from her before she'd finished deciding what it meant to be found. A woman near the front, gray-haired, a single silver ring through one eyebrow, a face that had clearly spent decades being unimpressed by dangerous men, stepped forward first. She did not offer a hand. She only looked at the jacket, and then at the woman wearing its shoulders like a shawl, and something crossed her face that was not pity. It was closer to recognition, the way you recognize a photograph of a place you lived in once and left without meaning to. "That's his stitching," the woman said. "Nobody sews a collar like that anymore." The confirmation moved through the crowd, the way water moves through cracked earth, not loud, not sudden, just a slow darkening as it reached each face. Somewhere behind her, a bike's engine finally cut out, and then another, until the lot was quiet enough that she could hear her own pulse in her ears. "Ma'am," the president said, and for the first time, his voice had the careful shape of a man choosing each word before he let it out. "We need to ask you something, and I need you to understand there's no wrong answer to it." He glanced once at the jacket, then back at her face. "How long have you been carrying this alone?" She did not answer right away. She looked instead at her hands, at the cracked knuckles and the ring finger with its pale groove, where a band used to sit before the pawn shop in Tulsa gave her $40 for it, and she seemed to be counting something in her head that had no clean number. 9 years, she said finally. "Give or take a winter." The president nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed a fact he already suspected and had been dreading. Nobody spoke. The wind moved through the lot, carrying the smell of diesel and cut grass from the field beyond the fence, and somewhere a screen door banged twice against its frame and went still. She noticed the sound the way she noticed everything now, from the outside, cataloging it rather than feeling it, the way a person learns to do when feeling has cost her too much for too long. "He never told us he had a wife," someone said, low, from the back of the crowd. It was not an accusation. It came out more like grief looking for a place to land. "He didn't tell me much either," she said, toward the end. The gray-haired woman who had recognized the stitching reached out then and touched the jacket's collar, not the woman's shoulder, just the fabric, the way you might touch a headstone to confirm it was real. Her fingers moved along the seam with a tenderness that made the woman in the jacket go very still, because it had been a long time since anyone had touched anything she was wearing with that kind of care. "He fixed this the week before. the gray-haired woman said. I remember because he was proud of it. Said the old collar was coming apart and he wasn't going to let it. He liked things that lasted, the woman said, and her voice cracked once, small, like a hairline fracture in glass that had held for years under pressure and had finally found the one word it couldn't bear. The president looked down at the ground for a moment, at the oil-stained concrete and the gravel scattered near the fence line, and when he looked up again, his jaw was working the way a man's jaw works when he is deciding whether to say something that cannot be unsaid. Ma'am, he said, I think you'd better come inside. There's things about that jacket and about him that I don't think you know, and I think it's time somebody told you. She did not move at first. Behind her, the impound lot's chain-link fence rattled once in the wind, and far off a semi-truck downshifted on the highway, the sound rolling flat across the empty field, like something remembering how to grieve. She followed him inside because there was nothing left in her to refuse with. The clubhouse smelled of engine oil and old coffee, of cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls so many years ago it no longer needed a cigarette to announce itself. Folding chairs scraped against the concrete floor as men made room, not looking at her directly, the way people avert their eyes from something too bright or too raw. She sat where she was told to sit, her hands folded in her lap, the way they had been folded on countless benches, in countless waiting rooms, for 2 years. The president did not sit. He stood by a corkboard cluttered with photographs curling at the edges, patches pinned beside them like small flags, and he took one down. A photograph of a younger man, laughing, squinting into sun that had probably not existed for a decade, and he set it on the table in front of her without a word. She looked at it the way a person looks at a name on a headstone they did not expect to find. That road, the president said, the one out past Coldwater Bridge, 9 years ago in March. You know the stretch I mean. Her hand went to her mouth, not fast, not dramatic, just slow, the way water finds the low place in a field. He wasn't just riding through, the president said. He was one of ours. Before your time with us, maybe. But not before his. Outside, the wind pushed against the corrugated siding, and somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. A younger member near the door shifted his weight, said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor like a man in church. There were 2 of our boys on that road that day, the president went on, and a truck that shouldn't have been in that lane. He put himself between them and it. We buried a patch that year, not just a man. He paused, and the pause held the weight of 9 marches. We didn't know he had a wife left behind. We didn't know anybody was left behind. She was crying now, without sound, the way people cry who have taught themselves, over years of solitary nights, that sound draws attention, and attention is a debt they cannot repay. You've been carrying his weight alone, the president said. That's not how this works. Not for us, not for family. The gray-haired woman reached over and set a hand on her shoulder, light as settling dust, and did not take it back. The room did not move for a long moment. Somewhere behind the bar, ice shifted in a cooler, a small sound like distant gravel. She looked down at the hand on her shoulder, then at the floor, then at the patch laid open on the table between them, its stitching soft with wear, the leather gone the color of old saddle. I didn't come here for this, she said. Her voice had thinned to something almost apologetic. I came because a man asked about a jacket. We know, the president said. Nobody's asking you to want it. She pulled her sleeve across her face, quick, embarrassed by her own hands. Around the room, the members had gone quiet, in the particular way men go quiet when grief moves through a space they didn't expect it in. Caps off, boots still, eyes finding something safe to rest on. A patch on a wall, a crack in the linoleum. The president turned to the room. 9 years, he said, and let the number sit there like a stone dropped in water, rings spreading outward. 9 years she's been out there, and none of us looked hard enough to find her. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. That ends tonight. Someone near the back murmured agreement, low, more breath than word. The young member by the door finally looked up, and what crossed his face was something between shame and resolve, the look of a man recalculating what he thought his colors meant. The gray-haired woman spoke for the first time, quietly, to her alone. You don't have to decide anything right now, she said. Nobody's handing you a bill. She said it the way you'd speak to a spooked horse, not because the woman was fragile, but because trust, once starved that long, has to be fed slowly, or it won't take at all. The woman's hands were still on the table, on either side of the folded leather, as if she were bracing herself against a table that might tilt. "I don't know how to let people do things for me anymore," she said. "I forgot how." "You don't have to remember all at once," the president said. Outside, a truck downshifted on the county road, the sound rising and falling and fading into the dark, and somewhere past the tin roof, the wind kept working at the corners of the building like it had all night to get in. Nobody moved to close the meeting. Nobody looked at a clock. For the first time in longer than she could measure, the woman sat in a room full of strangers and did not calculate the fastest way out. The impound lot released the sedan on a Tuesday morning in late October, frost still silvering the chain link, and nobody made a ceremony of it. A man with grease-black knuckles signed the paperwork, took the check, and did not ask why 40 bikers stood in his lot at 7 a.m. like pallbearers with nowhere to carry the coffin. The car itself went to salvage. She did not watch it go. She was already sitting in a truck cab between two men old enough to be her father, looking at a set of keys to an apartment 11 miles away, a one-bedroom above a hardware store with radiators that clanked and a window that looked out on nothing in particular, and she held those keys the way some people hold rosaries. The co-signing took 4 signatures and 11 minutes. The debt, the towing, the storage, the fines that had compounded like interest on a life she'd stopped fighting for, was paid in cash by men who did not discuss the amount in front of her, because a debt paid loudly is still a kind of theft. The grave sat on a slope outside town, under an oak that dropped its leaves in slow, deliberate spirals, and it was there, on a Sunday when the frost had not yet burned off the grass, that the chapter gathered without their bikes, in a loose half-circle, hats off. The president carried the jacket himself. 9 years of storage had not fully erased the smell of him, leather and diesel and something fainter beneath, something like the inside of an old wallet, and when the president laid it across her arms, she did not speak for a long moment, only ran her thumb along a seam that had been restitched twice, once by a woman's hand, and once, more recently, by someone who'd never met him. "He'd have laughed at all this," she said finally. "He hated a fuss." "He didn't get a say," the president said. "None of us do, once we're gone. That's the whole arrangement." She wore the jacket home. She wore it the following October, too, in the sidecar at the front of 47 machines idling in the cold, her hair pulled back, her spine straighter than it had been in 9 years, keeping pace with men who had once ridden past her without seeing her at all. She did not ask permission to be there. Nobody offered any. The road unspooled ahead of them, gray and ordinary, the way roads are, carrying nothing back that hadn't already been paid for, only forward, now, into whatever came next, at a speed